I'm not sure where I want to start, deep in geopolitiks land or leave Rad for the dessert. Let's go and kick off with the markets and start with Adi Imsirovic, Director, Surrey Clean Energy and Senior Associates at CSIS. Adi, I'll start with you because we had the Saudi oil minister overnight saying that this downward draft in oil prices is all because of the bad speculators and they've got it wrong. Your thoughts on his comments and what he's really pointing at there?
Morning, Sean. Yes, always the speculators when you run out of all the options. What's really been happening in the last few days is that a number of things. Let me take a step back. First of all, last couple of weeks, the margins have come under quite a bit of pressure. So we saw actually teapots cutting their runs. So that obviously didn't help demand very much. So what also happened was we've seen record US output and exports. Again, everyone's complaining about lack of investment in the shale patch, but actually every time we see the numbers, we keep hitting new records. The same is happening with non-OPEC countries as well. Europe is going into a bit of a recession. Dollar is very strong. But overall, the macro situation that drives the flat price, which I'm pretty sure Prince Abdulaziz knows very well, is not particularly good. Jerome Powell came out, I think, yesterday, indicating there might be some possible future interest rates hikes still on the cards. Dollar's very strong. And with the situation in Gaza, the likelihood of Iran getting involved is diminishing or has diminished almost completely, and the situation spreading. So the so-called risk premium has been taken out of the market as well. Overall, we've had a down week, as simple as that. If you actually look at the barrels on the ground, if you do want to forget about speculators, there's still unsold November Nigerian cargoes. It's quite poor, and they're a very good indicator. They're bellwether of what's happening in the spot market, because most of Nigerian cargoes are sold on spot basis, and they can go either east or west. So demand has not been very good. So neither macro nor fundamentals at the front end are looking particularly good.
Rad Al-Qadiri, looking at this equation from the point of view of the big geopolitical story, the war, the onslaught of Gaza, I'm learning out as superlatives to describe the horrors we're seeing on our TVs every day. But as Managing Director, Energy, Climate, Resources, the Eurasia Group, where do we see these two worlds intersect? The energy markets and their sort of irrelevance at such, when you look at such tragedies, but nonetheless, where do these two things, these big events, these geopolitical events interact? We heard a sort of off-the-cuff comment yesterday by Joe Biden that the Israeli Prime Minister had taken too long, or it was taking too long for him to answer his phone calls or answer his requests. Your thoughts on where all of this intersects?
Right. Great to be here again. I mean, I'd echo first, Adi's point about the geopolitical risk premium. It's a very cynical view, but markets can be very calculating. And fundamentally, there is no oil. There are no oil exports, and there is no oil in production in Israel or Gaza. And so, I think the markets were watching closely how much this might drift towards Iran. At this moment in time, for I think a variety of reasons, not least that nobody really wants to get involved in a fight, a wider fight. You've got that those flows seemingly protected, and as long as those flows seemingly are protected, then I think the impact on oil prices is going to be minimal. Where they intersect actually is what comes next. I think there's a lot of sanguine thinking, and as you mentioned, the sort of how many adjectives can you come up with the nature of the fighting? But I think there's some sanguine thinking about Israeli defense posturing in the medium to long term, and actually what the Israeli agenda really is. And if you look at that and look at some of the worst case scenarios that could happen there, particularly if there was a large refugee problem, if there's a large any efforts to transfer the Palestinian population or parts of it, I think that radicalizes the region and that heightens the pressure. I think the other thing really that stands there is if either armed groups linked to Iran continue to take potshots and actually lead to US casualties, and or any concrete evidence that Iran was involved in the 7th of October attacks, even though there appears to be none. I mean, one can fabricate evidence and intelligence, as the US has demonstrated so well in 2002, 2003. I think that's when, the risk of attacks on Iran start to rise again. And, Iranian oil production will be a tempting target to hit Iran and damage it economically. The thing then is it doesn't stop with Iran. And it's a question of, how much above the 1.4 million.
I mean, it is
barrels
interesting that in this equation, obviously, there is the relationship of the proxies of Iran and so forth. But nobody mentions any of the other Arab countries. This is an Arab country these Arab people that are getting slaughtered. I don't hear much talk of the call on others. Why Iran? I mean, this is not an Iranian problem. It's not a Persian problem. It's interesting that it is the one that gets brought in, and this is clearly a Palestinian Arab tragedy in ways, but that gets a big rabbit hole to go down. Let's go to Andy Critchlow and get your views, Andy, on the head of news, of course, EMEA, S&P Global Commodity Insights. Andy, the downward draft in the oil price has been underway now for some months. We did in June, nearly tempt $70 on Brent. WTI did drop below $70. So it's taken a lot to put a pole up in this tent and keep it from sort of sagging in. And that was the big bazooka, 1 million barrel a day extra cut by Saudi Arabia and off to the races in Q3. But the tent is starting to sag again. Is there going to be another pole in this tent? Or what is the downward draft ultimately, do you think, on this price?
It's very difficult to predict. I mean, there's elements of everything that has been said so far by both Rad and Eddie that factor into this. I think that with spot prices at the moment, what was mentioned around speculators, futures, when they fall so hard, so fast as they have done over the last month, if you're buying spot cargoes in the physical market, you tend to sit on your hands a little bit longer. And hopefully you get a better price. So it incentivizes people to take a pause, and that obviously has a downward drag impact on prices across the spectrum really. Demand, if you look at that, is pretty robust. Going into 2024, our estimate is for demand of about 104 plus million barrels a day. Oil and liquids. Okay, demand growth is going to slow. We're seeing demand growth slowing in 2024 to about 1.6 million barrels a day, but that's coming off, a very strong pull on crude liquid products that you've seen post-COVID, which we're kind of coming to the end of. OPEC does have very little room to move now. They've kind of backed themselves into a corner with successive voluntary cuts. Outside OPEC, you've got actually strong demand growth, strong supply growth coming from the US, from Africa. Will we see more of that?
It feels like that sort of echo chain. I mean, I've seen this show before, Addy, in a way, the cutting while others are increasing, and most notably a decade ago, shale. How much can you cut to keep the shale thing at bay? Are we on that track, Addy? Your thoughts? I mean, this Guyana, Venezuela, apparently I was reading a big story in Bloomberg overnight that all of the oil guys are back in the cafes of Caracas. The supply that's coming from outside this OPEC plus agreement looks, America starting like, there's no shortage of supply. And ultimately, these cuts by OPEC and Saudi start to feel not as supply constrained, but as, no problem, lots of idle supply. Your thoughts?
Well, just look at the excess capacity. It's massive. So it tells us something. Some probably shown some very, I don't want to be boring, but some basic economic theory here.
Very clean energy is boring but reliable. It has that sort of
absolutely boring is good.
It's good. It's good.
Like British politics, Labour Party.
Well,
yes.
So
Labour Party is good. So you basically have supply curve is not linear. So it's non-linear. Basically, it's very elastic in terms of price at the beginning, and as we actually trying to push the production to the limit, it becomes very inelastic. So what happens when demand falls? Demand crosses that supply curve at a fairly elastic part of the curve. So what happens, and that's what's happening right now. So if you can imagine sort of fairly elastic curve on supply, demand crossing it, when the Saudis cut, and it is, let's face it, pretty much Saudis, when they cut, there's very...
I don't even know how you count 300,000 of Russian barrels exports.
Is it products? Is it crude?
I mean, it's just
has it
smoke and mirrors, as it always has been,
Yes.
it always has been.
Exactly. So what happens when the Saudis cut? What happens exactly what's happening right now? You get a very small change in price. They make a very small impact on price. If anything happens, they actually, because they've cut 1 million barrels voluntarily, they've got a massive drop in revenue. And this is the problem right now. I agree with Andrew. You know what he said early on. OPEC is in a very tight corner right now, because if they cut further, all that will happen is that the Saudis or whoever cuts will have a big drop in revenue and not much impact on the price. You know,
budget deficit this year.
And all the Dajo is like, you know, there's the best cure for high prices is high prices. That's exactly what happened. Everyone else has pumped extra oil while the Saudis are trying to sort of save the world. But I would really like to see their most recent revenue numbers. They must be quite dismal. And we are getting in a situation where now we're going into Q1, Q2. Usually Q2 demand falls seasonally. Chinese have pretty much bought what they want to buy for the Chinese New Year celebrations and everything else.
Although apparently they put in requests for more export or import quotas.
Well, that's right. But what is also what's happening with China? You have to understand they've become the swing refinery of the world. They are basically pretty much setting the refining margins for globally with their quotas, import, export. So if they import more, they'll probably just export more anyway. So the situation is such that, you know, the overall, if you're a supplier or producer, you're not in a particularly great place right now, because you're not going to impact prices however powerful you are. So I think Saudis have a big issue. I'd love to see their revenue numbers lately. They must be very, very poor.
Well, certainly the Ramco earnings report was quite bionic, and they just delivered a huge amount of money to the fiscal purse.
And just one quick point, sorry, I forgot to mention earlier on the market. We had yesterday, WTI front spread went negative. We are in contango. Which
cuckoo in the coal mine, cuckoo in the coal mine.
Absolutely.
Brad, I was going to, we've just published our report today for the gathering of the insights captured in Fujairah a month ago. And the headline we put on the report was, will peace be the next Black Swan? And how, as you mentioned earlier, that the geopolitical premium is out of this price because there is no supply threat ultimately on the oil side from the Israeli invasion of Gaza. But ultimately we had some, I mean, let's just grab hold of the little bit of positive news, 4-hour ceasefire or something like that, or, you know, pause, or however horrible words are being chosen to stay on the right side of everybody agreeing on what to call this thing. But ultimately something positive has emerged in the last 24 hours. So my question to you, Rad, is while there's no geopolitical premium, what would a ceasefire do to the oil markets? Even though it's not giving us an upside, would a peace or would an actual ceasefire be a down? Would it be bearish? I mean, how would you think it would be absorbed by the markets?
I mean, it depends on the market mood, quite honestly. I mean, the market mood has been, you know, somewhat up and down and extensive this year. And if the market's in a bearish mood, it's going to take every piece of news it sees as being bearish. the reality, I think, Sean, sort of in terms of that is, one, in practical terms, in terms of physical supplies, it's going to do nothing. Gaza, Israel is, hits markets in second and third order consequences. It isn't something that's there directly. I'd look at it actually slightly the other way. I mean, one, I don't think a ceasefire happens anytime soon. I think Israel is buying time, and Israel has an agenda. It may not have followed through with the shock and awe that it was threatening, in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. But, if you look at the destruction that's being caused, if you look at the systematic nature of it, it may lead to the same outcome. But that's going to take some time to achieve. So I don't think, we're looking at a conflict that looks like, previous battles with Gaza. We may, the analogy to this may be the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and how some of that unfolded. But I also think, this question of what is the Israeli mindset is the one no one is able to answer right now. But it is critical, and it's critical for the markets, because if you're going to get escalation over time, that's most likely to be the driver. If Israel feels that it needs to be more aggressive, it needs to be more proactive, and it needs to deal with enemies far and wide, and let's face it, Iran comes up as one of the number one enemies in that case, then the risks are much greater. I think this is a market right now, for all of the reasons that Addy and Andrew mentioned, that is, moving into a period of weak fundamentals. So the market's going to want to
say Israel, Rad, when you say
physical supplies.
When you say Israel, obviously, Israel is many, at least it was, many pieces. I mean, a very fractured political system, bizarre coalitions, and in this terrible moment, this coalition that's in power right now, by all an assessment across the world, including from America and everywhere, is a very extreme right group. And their agenda before this event happened would have been clearance, right? They clear out the West Bank, clear out Gaza, and you would imagine that hasn't changed. And now they certainly seem to have, at least from their perspective, some sort of, legitimate sort of momentum to take that action. At least that's what it looks like to me. Other than the only thing that's missing is the Egyptians haven't opened the gates. Where does that go when you assess this from the point of view of this particular government versus all of Israel, and this particular government and their obvious alliance in Washington? Is there gap between them, or are they all on one page now?
I don't think they're all on one page at all. And that's the point. I think you did have this extreme right agenda, and it's being articulated. Now, whether it's carried out is another thing, but it's being articulated. But this is the point about how Israel responds. There seems to be a sense that somehow, things will calm down. Israel will see things rationally again. This attack basically had no impact on an Israeli psyche, and it's back to business as usual. How quickly can we get back to the Abraham Accords, and how quickly can we revive Israeli-Saudi discussions? Look at the US after 9/11. Look at the UK in the 1980s when the troubles in Ireland were brought to the mainland. It changes politics fundamentally. Governments make decisions that aren't necessarily rational. They are based on a different set of calculations. So why we are sitting, and Washington seems to be sort of pushing this notion that, one, it has the Israelis under control, and two, fundamentally everyone's going to go back and be nice to each other. It's just a matter of letting the dust settle and, killing a few Palestinians. I think the risk of escalation, the worst case scenario here, is much more real, and that will have an impact on markets. That plays out in the region over years and in multiple ways.
Andy, meanwhile, back at the ranch, OPEC has to gather in Vienna in 2 weeks' time to make decisions about the new year. How do they look at all of this? I mean, this whole thing of the commentary yesterday by the Saudi oil minister, the demand supply outlook for the new year. Where do you think they put their laser focus?
I think the OPEC meeting later this month, I think it's a huge Black Swan event that probably none of them want to actually deal with. And the reason is because of the conflict that's happening in Gaza. I mean, that the moment the Iranian oil minister and the delegation step off the plane in Vienna, and the wire reporters, put a microphone there at the airport, the first question they're going to ask is, are you going to call for an oil embargo? Which, as a paid-up member of OPEC, he's, legitimately able to do in a full meeting, to table a motion for however you phrase it, however unlikely, for an oil embargo. It's political grandstanding. It's the worst thing that the Saudi oil minister would want to have happen, because the meeting has all the scenarios in place to turn into just a political grandstanding opportunity for Iran in the current context of what's happening in the region. Now, of course,
so maybe the outcome is they actually go virtual. They don't go to Vienna.
Well, why would you do that? You have, one of the world's most,
for the reason you just said. Events. I mean, this is very complicated and emotional. And if it's still hot red like it is at the moment, in 4 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks time, my goodness, it just.
Well, you have all the world's TV cameras there. You have CNBC, you have CNN. Everyone's waiting outside the Secretariat. It's set up for histrionics, for someone to make a big political statement. If it's not the Iranians, someone will ask the Algerians, someone will ask the Libyans. So, enough people around that OPEC table feel strongly about this situation to use it as a platform. And I think there will be a lot of that happens. And I think that is a real concern for Saudi, because they've managed to keep politics out of OPEC, or at least outwardly facing out of OPEC for the last number of years. I mean, again, it was mentioned earlier about the economic situation in the Gulf as well. Saudi, okay, Ramco's had bumper profits, that pumps a lot of money back into the coffers in Saudi Arabia, but the economic situation is not bright. And to Rad's point, people make rational decisions, in periods of normality. The propensity to make irrational decisions increases as you come under economic strain, you come under political strain. The geopolitics, of course, of the war in Gaza is terrible at the moment, and you have to factor in this unforeseen risk of irrational decision making that will come out of the Gulf the longer that this conflict drags on, and that will feed into oil. And what are the irrational decisions that could be made here? I don't think the rhetoric around oil embargo, be it an Islamic oil embargo, whatever that may look like, which is what the Iranians are trying to push now, I don't think that's gone away. I really don't. I don't think that the geopolitical risk around disruption, be it through drone attacks on oil infrastructure, has gone away either. 2022, beginning of 2022, we had drones from Yemen hit oil facilities in Abu Dhabi. Recent conversations I had in Abu Dhabi indicated to me that those actual attacks were far more serious than was publicized at the time. So we're entering into a period of the unknown, and that's pretty dangerous.
But certainly, I suppose, of all things, let's go to the survey question. But Adi, I suppose the amazing thing on some level is that given everything that's going on, what is the main cause of downward draft in oil price? Weak demand outlook, plenty of idle supply, market speculators, choose your pick. All of the above was not on the menu today. The sort of the outlook of the direction of travel here. China still a bit of a laggard, but nonetheless, on a level. The U.S. economy, third quarter, still printing 4.9%. There's no obvious problems there, other than the sort of impact of 5% interest rates is sort of starting to trickle down. But where do you see this going? What breaks here?
Right. Well, as usual, the flat price or absolute price level is driven by fundamentals, macro fundamentals, as expected by financial players out there. So let's see where sort of we see this whole situation, say, next 3 to 6 months. China, as you mentioned, is still problematic. Every time we get some good news, the next thing we get some bad news. It's really struggling. And I actually think that it's going to continue to struggle for quite some time, because a subprime situation takes a while to get sorted out. And if it doesn't get sorted out in the next year or so, I think China has a serious danger of falling into sort of Japanese trap, where sort of these, property prices led on to 10 years of lost economic growth. So they need to sort that out, and it's not going to happen overnight. Europe is heading for a recession, and Europe is a big part of the world, even though not necessarily the biggest incremental consumer. The United States, yes, United States is doing actually very well, thank you very much, with all things considered. But you've noticed that gasoline demand in the United States is falling as well. So, OECD is we come into that sort of peak oil demand situation in the developed world where now, people are video conferencing and traveling less. So overall, the macro situation, especially I mentioned Powell's comments early on, we don't see that sort of drop in interest rates that we saw maybe a couple of months ago. There was, like I was talking about, light at the end of the tunnel. Right now, we still don't see that. Could be higher for longer. We also have unsettled situation with high debt everywhere in the Western world. Very volatile bond prices, both in United States and the UK, for example. So I just don't see the macro situation as being very a fertile ground for next bullish move in the oil market.
But especially as you go into the first quarter, which is typically, at least in the Western world or the Northern world, a weaker demand window.
Correct. Yeah. And overall, okay, US refiners have just recently come out of turnarounds, but we really haven't seen much as a result of that. Yes, there's been draws in Cushing, but overall, reserves in the US have actually increased in the last month or so. So there's nothing really to sort of write home about in terms of trying to be bullish. I think this market is very likely to go sideways, as I mentioned earlier. I think Saudis probably should know, and I think they do know, that any further cuts are very unlikely to actually impact prices very much. So the situation is very much wait and see. As Andy and Rad mentioned, I think the geopolitics will play a bit of a role in the market and volatility.
Well, let's go to that point, Rad. Sort of closing comments on something we didn't touch on and haven't regularly as we had obviously before. But where is Ukraine in all of this? Where does Russia's invasion of Ukraine and now as we go into winter and the intersection of this crisis in Palestine, where do those two things interact in the geopolitics of the big world at the top table of the 20 guys who are deciding on which direction this planet moves?
I think Ukraine maybe summarizes up a creek without a paddle, or at least increasingly getting towards there. And that
running out of road, so to speak.
Yeah, and that's not just a product of, I think, that's not just a product of attention being diverted to Israel and Gaza. In geostrategic terms, if we're looking at this over the next 10 years, sadly but true, Israel Gaza is an echo of the past. What happens in Ukraine is seen certainly by the United States and others as shaping the future. So I think attention is going to go back. The problem is, you have an issue of aid fatigue that's going in. It's a clear political division in the United States. The EU, if the US starts to pull away, is going to be in a position where it's left carrying the baby, and it's not going to want to do that. So I think, you can see sort of circumstances in which, the absence of real breakthrough by the Ukrainians, if the Russians were to sort of be able to mount a meaningful offensive, that some of the dynamics of that change. Again, in geostrategic terms, it really matters. And I think, there will be sort of attention will go back to it.
In a lot of ways, though, it feels like this event in Gaza has stripped away Europeans' justice call, the idea of power politics dominate, and the idea of war crimes and human rights and all of these things, where the call to the world to acknowledge that has just crumbled.
Like, you and I both have been in this game for a long, long time. Political rhetoric is one thing, political reality is another, and political reality is incredibly cynical. I have watched politicians go through mental gymnastics to speak out of both sides of their mouth, and this is no different. Actually, it's one point just to leave you with that's really going to matter, I think, in 3 weeks in the UAE. Because you're walking into a COP28 where what's happened in Ukraine already stirred up, global north, global south tensions. And the sense of some lives matter more than others has just been reinforced. And that starts to drive a deeper wedge between the global north and global south. It creates geostrategic issues. But if you're trying to reach any sort of climate goals or any sort of climate progress, it makes it much more difficult.
Andy, last word to you here. Is there a second pole that OPEC can put in this tent? Is that the Saudi energy minister? I mean, he's been notable in his tenure for infamously making the shorts ouch. Does he have an ouch up his sleeve here? What if he does? What would it look like?
It's hard to see it, and it's hard to see it because if you look at the core Gulf states, they're going to have something like 4 million barrels plus of spare capacity going into next year that's just sat there doing nothing. And when you've got prices floating around the low 80s, our forecast is for average Brent of around $85 a barrel next year. That still doesn't cut it in terms of the macroeconomics of the Gulf and what these the petrodollar states of the region need to finance their budgets. Ultimately, that's much closer, if not above, $100 a barrel. I think that they're getting very close to being, at the end of the road in terms of what they.
There's a rollover. I mean, Saudi didn't choose on this occasion with their unilateral cut to give it a horizon of time. They just did it 1 month at a time. If they were to come out with a 3 month or all of 2024 or something more robust like that, could that be a second more powerful pole in this tent to keep it above 80?
Is it just a signal for everyone else to cheat on their quotas and and for more production, to lose more market share to emerging producers outside sort of OPEC's immediate sphere of influence? I mean, we talked about Venezuela. Venezuela is within OPEC, but we talked about the resurgence in interest in Venezuela. You have Africa, Guyana. You have a lot of production coming on stream elsewhere, and that's not going to be slowed. That oil needs to come out of the ground, and I think they're in a very tight spot. They've kept cutting. They've kept on with voluntary cuts. I think the issue about Ukraine is interesting. What happens with the war in Ukraine? I tend to agree with Rad that we're getting towards this kind of period. We haven't had a breakthrough. I've talked previously about in my perception, looking at it, that in a way the war is over there, because I just can't see the West continuing to fund Ukraine to the extent that they have. Will there be some movement towards peace talks there? Does that change Russia's perspective on its relationship with OPEC Plus? And I think going into 2024, 2025, I think that's the interesting thing to watch here. It
does look like Russia is, and many other. I think that's where the challenge for Saudi and Riyadh will be. Continue to deliver the big gift to everybody else while they carry the heavy bucket. Even Russia benefiting greatly with 300,000 barrels a day, whatever that is. It's a rounding up error. Everybody's benefiting from the burden and the bucket that Saudi's carrying. Will they make that bucket even heavier for themselves next year? It seems like a tough question. But they definitely want and need $80+ oil. So let's see where that goes. Maybe, as the minister said yesterday, this is a false alarm. This is a blip, and that the real demand fundamentals will take this market higher. Listen, have a great weekend. Thank you so much, as always. Rad Al-Qadiri, really appreciate your insights. Adi Absirovic, all the way from Surrey, and Andy Critchlow, thank you so much. Really, thank you for that. And hopefully Miss Braverman won't get her wishes on the weekend, and we'll see another good, strong expression of civic rights and public thoughts on the streets of London this weekend. All the best. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.